Imagine finishing a long shift as a nurse, helping patients, saving lives, then walking home from the train station like you've done 100 times before. But tonight, 5 monsters in a stolen car are prowling the streets, looking for a victim. Tonight, your beauty, your kindness, your very existence makes you their target. This happened to 26-year-old Anita Cobby in Sydney, 1986. What these 5 men did to her was so brutal that hardened detectives wept, the nation demanded justice, and Australia changed forever. This is the story that broke a country's heart and proved that sometimes evil comes in packs. You're about to hear about a crime so savage it redefined brutality in Australia. Anita Cobby was a former Miss Australia contestant turned dedicated nurse who spent her days healing others. But on February 2, 1986, she encountered 5 predators whose capacity for evil knew no bounds. Stay with me because this story will show you how one woman's courage in her final moments led to justice that Australia had never seen before, and never will again. Anita Lorraine Lynch was born on November 2, 1959, into a world that seemed to celebrate her from the very beginning. She wasn't just beautiful in the conventional sense, though she undoubtedly was, having competed in the Miss Australia contest. She possessed something far more precious, a genuine desire to help others that would define her entire too short life. Growing up in Blacktown, New South Wales, Anita developed the kind of personality that drew people like moths to a flame. She was warm, compassionate, and possessed an infectious laugh that could light up any room she entered. Those who knew her best described her not as the stunning woman whose photographs would later grace newspaper front pages across Australia, but as someone who genuinely cared about making the world a better place. This desire to heal and help others led Anita to pursue nursing, a profession that allowed her to channel her natural empathy into meaningful work. By 1986, she was working as a dedicated nurse at Sydney Hospital, spending her days caring for patients who often had no one else to advocate for them. Her colleagues remember her as someone who never took shortcuts, who always had time to listen to a worried family member or comfort a scared patient. At 26, Anita was in the prime of her life. She had recently separated from her husband John Cobby, but the split was amicable, and she was focusing on building her career and finding her own path in the world. She had moved back in with her parents, Grace and Gary Lynch, in their Blacktown home while she figured out her next steps. It was a temporary arrangement that gave her the stability she needed during a period of transition. February 2, 1986, started like any other day for Anita. She woke up in her childhood bedroom, prepared for another shift at the hospital, and kissed her parents goodbye before heading off to work. She had no way of knowing that this ordinary Sunday would become the date that changed Australian criminal history forever. Her shift at Sydney Hospital was typical. Long hours spent caring for patients, checking medications, and providing the kind of compassionate care that had made her so respected among her peers. As evening approached and her shift ended, Anita began the journey home that she had made countless times before. She caught the train from the city back to Blacktown, a routine trip that usually ended with a phone call to her father for a ride from the station. But on this particular night, fate conspired against her in the cruelest way possible. When Anita arrived at Blacktown station just before 10 p.m., she discovered that the public phone she normally used to call for her ride was broken. It was a small mechanical failure that would have devastating consequences. Instead of waiting or finding another phone, Anita made the decision that would seal her fate. She decided to walk home. The walk from Blacktown station to her parents' house was about 2 kilometers through suburban streets that she knew well. During daylight hours, it was a pleasant enough journey through residential neighborhoods where families lived their quiet lives behind lit windows. But at night, especially on a quiet Sunday evening, those same streets became isolated corridors where anything could happen. As Anita began walking along Newton Road, she had no way of knowing that she was being watched. 5 men in a stolen Holden Torana were cruising the area, looking for exactly what predators always seek: a vulnerable target. They had spent the evening drinking, taking drugs, and feeding off each other's increasingly violent impulses. They weren't looking for money or possessions. They were hunting for something far more sinister. The 5 men who would destroy Anita Cobby's life represented the absolute worst of human nature. They weren't criminal masterminds or sophisticated predators. They were something far more frightening. Ordinary men who had chosen to embrace evil so completely that they had lost any trace of humanity. John Raymond Travers, 18, was the ringleader of this pack of monsters. Despite his youth, he had already established himself as someone who delighted in causing pain to others. He was the kind of person who saw vulnerability as an opportunity and kindness as weakness to be exploited. The Murphy brothers, Leslie, 22, Michael, 17, and Gary, 28, came from a family where violence was normalized and empathy was seen as a character flaw. They had grown up in an environment where might made right and the strong preyed upon the weak without consequence. Michael Peter Murdoch, 19, completed this group of predators. Together, they formed a pack that was far more dangerous than any of them would have been individually. They fed off each other's worst impulses, escalating their behavior to levels of brutality that none might have reached alone. On the evening of February 2nd, these 5 men had been driving around in their stolen car, drinking heavily and using drugs that lowered whatever inhibitions they might have once possessed. They had been talking about finding someone to assault, building each other's excitement and courage through shared fantasy and mutual encouragement of their worst impulses. When they spotted Anita walking alone on Newton Road, they saw exactly what they had been looking for: a beautiful woman, isolated and vulnerable, with no one around to help her. To them, she wasn't a person with dreams, fears, and people who loved her. She was simply an object for their gratification. As Anita walked along Newton Road, focused on getting home safely, the stolen Holden pulled up beside her. What happened next unfolded with the terrible inevitability of a nightmare. The men called out to her, initially trying to lure her to the car with false offers of help or a ride home. When Anita, displaying the street smarts that every woman develops, politely declined and continued walking, the men's facade of friendliness instantly evaporated. They stopped the car, jumped out, and physically dragged her into the vehicle despite her screams and desperate attempts to fight them off. Anita was kidnapped while walking home from Blacktown railway station just before 10 p.m. on February 2, 1986. In those terrifying moments, as she was forced into the car with 5 strangers whose intentions were clearly malevolent, Anita must have realized that her life was in mortal danger. The men drove her to a remote location in nearby Prospect, an area of farmland and open spaces where no one would hear her screams or come to her aid. What happened during that car ride can only be imagined. The terror of being trapped with 5 increasingly aggressive men, the desperate mental calculations of whether to fight, flee, or try to talk her way out of the situation. What occurred in that isolated field and Prospect on the night of February 2, 1986, was so brutal and inhumane that the details shocked even experienced homicide detectives who had seen the worst that humanity could offer. The rape and murder of Anita Cobby is arguably the best-known murder in Sydney, on account of the particularly horrific circumstances of the crime. For hours, these 5 monsters took turns assaulting Anita in ways that defied human comprehension. They showed her no mercy, no compassion, and no recognition of her basic humanity. She begged for her life, pleaded with them to let her go, promised she wouldn't identify them. But her words fell on ears that had chosen to hear only their own twisted desires. The level of violence these men inflicted was beyond what was necessary to accomplish their sick goals. They seemed to delight in her suffering, escalating their brutality as the night wore on. It wasn't enough for them to assault her. They needed to dominate her completely, to strip away every shred of dignity and hope. When they had finished with their assault, when they had taken everything they wanted from this innocent woman, they faced a choice. They could have left her there, traumatized but alive. Instead, they chose murder. Cobby was killed that night by being repeatedly stabbed and gashed with barbed wire before having her neck sliced. In her final moments, as these monsters prepared to take her life, Anita showed the kind of courage that defined who she was as a person. Even facing certain death, she maintained her dignity and her humanity in a way that her killers never could. She died as she had lived, with grace under the most impossible circumstances. On the morning of February 4, 1986, a dairy farmer in the outer Sydney suburb of Prospect noticed his cows had been behaving strangely. 4 hours they had stood gathered at one particular spot in his paddock. When he went to investigate what was disturbing his livestock, he made a discovery that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The farmer went to see what they were doing and found the brutalized body of 26-year-old Anita Cobby. The condition of her remains told a story of unimaginable brutality that even hardened investigators struggled to process. The scene was so shocking that several officers had to step away to compose themselves before they could continue their work. News of the discovery spread quickly through law enforcement channels, and soon some of Sydney's most experienced detectives were working the case. They had seen murders before, but nothing quite like this. The level of violence inflicted on Anita went far beyond what was necessary to kill her. It spoke to a kind of sadistic pleasure in causing suffering that chilled everyone who encountered it. The investigation began immediately, with police canvassing the area, looking for witnesses, and trying to piece together what had happened during Anita's final hours. They knew they were looking for more than one perpetrator. The evidence made it clear that multiple people had been involved in the assault and murder. The investigation into Anita's murder became one of the largest and most intensive in New South Wales history. Police worked around the clock, following every lead and interviewing hundreds of people. The public response was immediate and overwhelming. Everyone wanted these monsters caught and brought to justice. 22 days later, 5 men, John Travers, Michael Murdoch, and brothers Leslie, Michael, and Gary Murphy, were taken into custody. The arrests came after a careful investigation that included witness statements, forensic evidence, and the kind of detective work that builds airtight cases. When police finally had their suspects in custody, the confessions came quickly. Faced with overwhelming evidence and the reality of what they had done, the men began turning on each other, each trying to minimize his own role in the crime while implicating his co-conspirators. The details that emerged during questioning were so disturbing that even experienced investigators were shaken. The men showed no genuine remorse for what they had done, only regret that they had been caught. They seemed incapable of understanding that they had destroyed not just Anita's life, but the lives of everyone who loved her. Each was sentenced to life imprisonment, without the possibility of parole, on June 16, 1987. The trial was one of the most closely watched in Australian history, with the public demanding nothing less than the harshest possible sentences for these monsters. Justice Alan Maxwell, in sentencing the 5 men, made it clear that their crimes were beyond the pale of human decency. The perpetrators were sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of release, marking the first time in New South Wales history that such sentences had been handed down. The judge's words resonated far beyond the courtroom. He spoke not just about the specific crimes committed against Anita, but about the broader message that society needed to send about violence against women and the protection of the innocent. These men would never again have the opportunity to hurt another person. The tragedy that broke the heart of a nation became a watershed moment in Australian criminal justice. The case sparked national conversations about violence against women, the adequacy of sentences for the most serious crimes, and the need to protect society's most vulnerable members. Sydney nurse Anita Cobby's killers remain behind bars, 30 years on, their files marked, never to be released. The unprecedented sentences sent a clear message that some crimes are so heinous that rehabilitation is neither possible nor relevant. Some people simply need to be permanently removed from society. The case also led to significant changes in how sexual assault and murder cases were prosecuted in Australia. Anita's death became a catalyst for legal reforms that better protected victims and ensured that the most serious criminals faced appropriate consequences for their actions. Beyond the horror of her final hours, it's important to remember Anita Cobby for who she was in life. A dedicated nurse who spent her days caring for others, a woman with dreams and aspirations who was taken from the world just as she was beginning to find her own path. Her colleagues at Sydney Hospital remember her not as a victim, but as a healer who brought comfort to patients during their most vulnerable moments. Her family remembers her as a beloved daughter whose laughter could fill a room and whose compassion knew no bounds. Anita's story serves as a reminder of the random nature of evil and the importance of never taking our safety for granted. But it also stands as a testament to the power of justice when a community refuses to accept that such crimes can go unpunished. In the years since her death, Anita has become a symbol not just of victimization, but of the demand for justice that can unite a nation. Her legacy lives on in the legal precedents set by her case, the lives saved by the longer sentences that keep predators locked away, and the ongoing fight to protect women from violence. 5 convicted killers sentenced to die in jail represents more than just punishment. It represents society's recognition that some lines cannot be crossed without permanent consequences. The 5 men who destroyed Anita Cobby's life will spend their remaining years behind bars, a living reminder that evil actions have lasting consequences. The case of Anita Cobby changed Australia forever. It showed that beauty and kindness could make someone a target, that evil could strike anyone at any time, but also that a civilized society would not tolerate such crimes. Her death was senseless and tragic, but the justice that followed sent a message that resonates to this day. As we remember Anita Cobby, we honor not just her memory, but our collective commitment to protecting the innocent and ensuring that monsters like her killers never again have the opportunity to destroy innocent lives. Her story is one of tragedy, but also of a justice system that rose to meet the challenge of unprecedented evil. The 5 men who killed Anita Cobby remain behind bars nearly 4 decades later, their files marked never to be released. It is a fitting end to a case that showed both the worst and the best of humanity, the capacity for absolute evil, and the determination to ensure that such evil faces absolute justice. Anita Lorraine Cobby was more than a headline, more than a case study in criminology. She was a healer, a daughter, a woman with dreams who deserved to live them. While we cannot bring her back, we can ensure that her story continues to serve as both a warning about the evil that exists in the world and a testament to the justice that awaits those who choose to embrace it.